spooky season, we are going to cover quite the spooky author and some of his scarier works as well. I'd like to highlight his career and some of his living situations, especially early on in his life, which has informed his work. And it is none other than Stephen King himself. He needs no introduction, and we're going to get started. By the way, my name is Nick Oliveri, and I'm a proud service learner for the Monterey County Free Library System and Establishment. So I'm really excited to kick this one off. Let's start with Stephen King's early childhood, where it all began. He is technically a boomer, born in 1947 in Maine, Portland, Maine, actually. And he was moved all around from place to place to place, Connecticut, Chicago, Illinois, and the list kind of goes on from there, sadly. His father left his family, his mother, him, and his older brother David, when he was just 2 years old. Now, this will be traumatic for anyone. This is tough for everyone. And this left their family, and especially his mother, who was the only breadwinner at the time, kind of at times in destitution, in poverty, and financially struggling throughout most of his childhood. While these sad and really traumatic events and tough living situation kind of harmed King in the immediate, I believe he used these misfortunes and some of these tougher struggles and channeled all that pain, or some of that pain, into the beautiful and shocking art that he has done throughout his whole career, an illustrious one, as I might say. So a little bit more on Stephen King. He graduated from the University of Maine, where he met his wife, and I believe they're still happily married. They primarily live in Maine, around a lake, a Kezar Lake, but I'm sure he has multiple houses. Throughout his career, he sold over 350 million books aggregate across all of the works he's ever published, making him one of the most sought after and sold writers, entertainers, literally in history. His works have been, I don't know if you recognize movies like, say, The Shining or Carrie or Cujo, and the list goes on from there. Highly influential is an understatement for Stephen King. Now, going back to a little bit of his early life and influences, he started writing at a young age. He just had, some people, he was kind of blessed, even though he had a tough upbringing at times. He was blessed with finding his purpose early on in his childhood. He began to write these short stories and try to get published, and he got rejected over, I believe, 100 times. And every rejection he'd paste, or rather pin to a bulletin board in his small room in the house he lived at for a little later on in his childhood, as things got a bit more stable for his upbringing. Another thing about Stephen King, which is funny as it is important, is he would sneak into drive-in movies and in just theaters in general, and he loved, of course, the genre of horror. So he was greatly influenced by the horror genre. He just always just as he had a predilection towards writing, he also had a predilection towards the horror genre. So it was... So he would sneak into horror movies. He'd often try to get his older brother David to come. Occasionally he would, occasionally he wouldn't. But Stephen King would never shy away from getting scared. And even as a consumer of movies and books, that's where he gained that he kind of liked being scared. And he actually wanted to, whether he studied it purposefully or not, from consuming those movies and those books and those films, and even short stories, that informed his career later on. So he continued to start trying to write novel after novel after novel, and they failed, couldn't get him published, and he was pretty much destitute with his wife. They were living in a trailer after graduating from Maine, and I believe Stephen King was an English teacher at the time, or shortly, a few years after they graduated. You can check me on that, but he was an English teacher. He enjoyed it, but he could never get that creative bone in his body to go away. He could never break that creative bone. It was made of steel in a way. So funny story, but also highly influential story. One of the most important and pivotal parts of King's life was when he started to write the book Carrie. This was his, I believe, debut novel, and it also turned into a highly influential movie that I believe aired and was produced and released in the 70s. You can check me on that as well. But it was still decades and decades and decades ago, because King was born in 47, and his influence has spread basically from the 60s onward in terms of his work. So quite amazing. Now, the story behind Carrie, I believe Stephen King was actually cleaning a bathroom, believe it or not. And it was the girls' bathroom after hours. So no one was in there. He was just cleaning it. And he saw a tampon dispenser. Either that or a tampon, something that had to do with tampons and the disposal and dispense of tampons. And even though he wasn't a woman, clearly, he just had this little seed in his mind about the struggle and some of the strife of a girl going through puberty and all those hormonal changes and all that, and sometimes embarrassment and these rampant emotions from happiness to sadness to depression even. And he pictured in his mind, when he saw these tampons, he pictured a whole story about like one of the darkest journeys that a girl could go through. A little bit more on Carrie, the actual book and the work itself. It was about a girl who was deeply isolated and kind of not tortured physically, but tortured and abused mentally and psychically. And so this girl, Carrie, just grew up being made fun of by her peers, and it was at a time where she was going through puberty and was getting her period and things along those lines. And eventually Carrie, and it is set in kind of like an old, I'll say rural town. And she eventually, at the prom, at this big dance that everyone was having, she didn't have a date because she was the lowest on the totem pole in terms of status. And everyone, whether they like it or not, is concerned with status. Even if you have a tiny ego or not at all, you believe in status. It's a human thing. And Carrie actually gained these magical powers, more so supernatural powers. And she ended up burning and destroying the entire city and actually killing many people in this burst of emotion and anger. And to me, this work is very indicative of how we can treat people. I don't think anyone's going to grow supernatural powers as Carrie did and take on this more surreal story. I'm not sure if I believe in that, and most may not. However, think about all that anger and angst that actually enters a person and deepens and rots in their soul and continues to cling on to their heart. And this could have been avoided by Carrie's mother, by Carrie's peers, and by the town itself in which Carrie grew up in, and they all abandoned her. But real quick before we end this off, yes, I'm talking about Carrie for the most part because this was his debut work, which actually famously made him into the success he is today. Of course, he writes about 1,000 words a day. I've read his autobiography numerous times. It's a highly influential work to me as an author. Quick story about Carrie. Started writing it, and then after a few pages or even maybe a few chapters, maybe like 40 to 50 pages or so, crumpled it up, threw it in the trash. And his beloved wife one day went into that trash, uncrumpled the paper, started reading Carrie, and presumably she goes, "Stephen, you have something here. This is good. This is really good." And so Stephen King said, "You know what? Why not finish this? Why not go for it?" And among those many, 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 many numerous rejections, and he had an infinitesimal chance at getting published at that time, because self-publishing, besides Virginia Woolf about 100 years ago with Hogarth Press, was very difficult to do. So he had to go the traditional route and get accepted by the industry. And he submitted Carrie, and he got a $250,000 advance. So guess what? Back then, that went a lot further than it does now. Got him out of the trailer park into a comfortable home, And guess what? It sold a ton of copies, and it made Stephen King a household name, just like that. And then, of course, he continued on to be basically the most successful writer of all time, if not the most, probably top 10, including Dante, Hemingway, the list goes on. So I hope that really helped kind of just bring some light to, in during spooky season and approaching Halloween, someone who is kind of the master of horror, especially in the modern day. So I hope you enjoyed. Like I said, my name is Nick Oliveri. Thank you so much.